Welcome back to Calm Tutorials. If you have been here before, you already know what this is. A quiet place, a slow pace, history told without drama, without urgency, without anything you need to do except listen. If this is your first time, you are welcome here. There is nothing to catch up on. Every episode begins again from the beginning, and tonight's beginning is the British Postal Service, 1516 to 1900. Let your breathing slow. Let the day go. We have a long time together tonight, and all of it is yours. And before we begin, if you enjoy calm history stories like these, consider subscribing to the channel. It quietly helps Calm Tutorials grow, and it makes sure these peaceful journeys continue to find their way to you each night. Before we travel back to the 16th century, settle in. Find a comfortable position. Let the sounds of wherever you are fade a little into the background. The story you're about to hear is a long one, nearly 400 years of history, and it moves at the pace of a post horse on a muddy country road. It will not rush, it will not surprise you. It will take you very gently through one of the most quietly important institutions in the history of the English-speaking world, a system so ordinary, so daily, so unremarkable in its mature form that most people never thought about it at all, which is, of course, exactly the point. This is the history of the British Post Office. It is a story about letters and how they traveled, about roads and the men who rode them, about sorting rooms and the smell of wax seals and paper dust, about rates and charges and parliamentary debates and the slow perfection of a bureaucratic machine, about rain and mud and winter darkness and a rider pressing on through it all because the mail had to arrive. It is, in its own way, one of the great stories of how a country becomes modern, and it is told here slowly, carefully, and in full. Close your eyes if you like. The first letter is already on its way. There is something worth knowing about the very beginning of organized postal communication in England, something that most people would find mildly surprising if they thought about it for a moment. When Henry VIII established what would eventually become the British Post Office in the year 1516, he was not thinking about the public at all. He was not imagining a system by which an ordinary man in Bristol might send a letter to his cousin in Norwich. He was not considering the needs of merchants or lovers or mothers writing to sons away at sea. He was thinking about himself. He was thinking about his government. He was thinking about control. The institution Henry created was called the King's Posts, and it existed for one purpose only: to carry the communications of the Crown from London to the borders of the realm and back again. It was a military and administrative instrument, as naked in its intentions as a sword. The roads of England in the early 16th century were not the well-maintained arteries they would eventually become. They were rough, uneven, often barely more than worn paths across common land, subject to flooding in winter and choking dust in summer. Moving information quickly across such a country was genuinely difficult, and the government of a king required quick information. The system Henry established was built around a series of fixed stations spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart along the principal roads leading out of London. At each of these stations, a postmaster was appointed. This was usually a local man of some standing, an innkeeper, a minor gentleman, someone with the resources and reliability to maintain horses and a small staff. His responsibility was simple but essential. He kept a supply of fresh horses at all times, ready for the royal messengers who would arrive at his door at any hour of the day or night. The messenger would arrive, hand over whatever he was carrying, receive a fresh horse, and ride on to the next station. Or alternatively, the message itself would be transferred to a fresh rider at each station, passed from hand to hand along the road like a relay baton, each rider responsible only for the short stretch between his station and the next. This second method was actually faster for long distances, since a fresh rider on a fresh horse covered ground more quickly than a tired man on a tired animal. The system was not original to Henry. The Romans had used something similar, and so had the Mongol Empire, and so had the Persians before them. What Henry did was adapted for the particular geography and administrative needs of Tudor England. The roads along which these posts were established ran outward from London like the spokes of a wheel. The Great North Road was the most important, running up through Huntingdon and Stamford and York, and eventually to the Scottish border at Berwick. This road carried the most vital royal communications, particularly during periods of tension with Scotland, which in the early 16th century was more often than not. There was also a road running west toward Bristol, the great port city, whose commercial importance to the crown was considerable. There was a road running through Canterbury toward the Kent coast, important for communications with the continent. And there were roads running into Wales, a country only recently brought under something approaching English administrative control, where the need for reliable royal communication was especially pressing. The postmasters along these roads led lives of considerable tedium, punctuated by occasional bursts of frantic activity. For the most part, nothing happened. They maintained their horses. They kept the stable yard in order. They dealt with whatever other business occupied their time, the inn trade, the farming of their land, the ordinary commerce of a provincial life. And then, at some unpredictable moment, a rider would appear out of the darkness or the rain, shouting for fresh horses, and the machinery of the royal post would creak into motion for a few urgent minutes before settling back into its habitual quiet. Payment was irregular and often delayed. The crown was not always a prompt payer, and postmasters frequently found themselves waiting months or even years for the fees owed to them for their services. This was not peculiar to the postal system. It was a general feature of Tudor government finance, but it made the position of postmaster less attractive than it might otherwise have been, and finding reliable men to fill the role was an ongoing administrative problem throughout the 16th century. The cost of maintaining a horse ready for instant use was not trivial. A good post horse required feeding, shoeing, grooming, and veterinary care. It required a stall, bedding, and water. It required a groom to look after it, and a stable yard in which to keep it. A postmaster with 4 or 6 horses standing ready at all times was maintaining a small but real enterprise, and the crown's habit of paying late and paying little made this enterprise a financial burden as often as it was a source of income. In the early years of the system, a postmaster who needed to summon a rider or pass a message along the route had a specific way of doing so. He carried or kept available a horn, a long instrument of brass or tin, whose sound could carry for considerable distances across open country. The sound of the post horn became, over the course of the following centuries, one of the most recognizable sounds in England, a sound that meant news was coming, that the world beyond the horizon had sent a message. But in its earliest days, it was simply a practical tool for signaling between stations on a muddy road in the rain. The speeds achieved by this early postal system were, by later standards, quite remarkable. On the Great North Road, in good conditions, a message could travel from London to Berwick, nearly 350 miles, in roughly 60 hours. This required riders changing horses at every station, pressing on through the night, covering perhaps 15 or 18 miles per hour on the fastest sections. Under bad conditions, with flooding or snow or broken roads, the same journey might take 4 or 5 days. But the general capability of the system, the idea that information could travel faster than a single horse and rider, that a network of stations could relay a message at speed across an entire country, was genuinely new, at least in the English context, and it gave the Tudor government a significant administrative advantage over any form of communication that depended on a single courier making an entire journey alone. Throughout the middle decades of the 16th century, the system remained essentially what Henry VIII had established. It was maintained under Edward VI and under Mary I and under Elizabeth I, each monarch finding in it a useful instrument of government. The staff of the royal posts grew slowly. A master of the posts was appointed, an official responsible for overseeing the entire system, appointing and supervising postmasters, dealing with complaints about service and delays, and managing the Crown's financial obligations to the men who staffed the stations. This position would eventually evolve over many generations and many reorganizations into the Postmaster General, the political head of what would become the post office. The Elizabethan period brought with it an expanding sense of what the postal routes might be used for. The roads were there, the horses were there, the postmasters were there, and a growing number of private individuals, merchants, lawyers, gentlemen with estates in the country and business in London, were beginning to wonder whether they might not make use of this machinery for their own purposes. The Crown was not enthusiastic about this idea. The royal posts were an instrument of government, not a commercial service, and the authorities were concerned that allowing private traffic could compromise the security and reliability of the system. Messages sent on royal business had to arrive promptly and confidentially. If the same horses and riders were also carrying private correspondence, there was a risk of confusion, delay, and leaking of sensitive information. But practical need has a way of overcoming institutional reluctance. Merchants needed to communicate with their agents. Landowners needed to correspond with their London lawyers. Officials in the provinces needed to write to their families in the capital. And in the absence of any alternative system, they began to use the royal posts, quietly, informally, paying whatever the local postmaster would accept. This private traffic was officially tolerated rather than formally permitted, and it would remain in this somewhat ambiguous status for many decades, a gray area in which common practice ran considerably ahead of official policy. By the end of the 16th century, England had a postal system of modest but real capability. It was limited in its coverage. The official routes ran only along the main roads, and large areas of the country were served, if at all, by unofficial arrangements of varying reliability. It was limited in its purpose. Officially, it existed to serve the Crown, not the public. And it was limited in its regularity. Messages traveled when there was something to carry, not on a fixed schedule. But it existed. The infrastructure was in place, the habit of organized communication was established, and the stage was set, though nobody yet knew it, for the long, slow development of something far larger. The 16th century was, in this, as in so many things, a beginning. The seeds of the British postal system had been planted in the administrative soil of the Tudor state, watered by practical necessity, and left to grow in whatever direction the following centuries would take them. That growth would be slow, uneven, sometimes barely perceptible from one decade to the next, but it was underway. The 17th century opened with England in a state of considerable administrative and political complexity. The reign of James I brought the union of the English and Scottish crowns, a development with significant implications for the postal system, since the roads connecting London to Edinburgh now carried not merely diplomatic traffic, but the communications of a genuinely unified royal court. The Great North Road became, in a new sense, a road of national importance, not merely connecting England's capital to its northern border, but connecting two capitals of a single kingdom. The postal administration of this period was managed by a series of officials whose titles and responsibilities shifted with some frequency, reflecting the general instability of early Stuart government. The master of the posts continued to exercise overall responsibility, but the details of day-to-day management were increasingly handled by a growing staff of subordinate officials. The system was becoming more complex as it expanded, and complexity required administration, and administration required people, and people required payment, and payment required organization, a cycle that would characterize the post office's development throughout its history. It was during the reign of James I that the first serious moves were made toward opening the postal system to general public use. This was not, it should be said, a sudden decision driven by enlightened policy. It was a gradual, somewhat grudging recognition that the unofficial private use of the royal posts had grown to such a scale that it could no longer be pretended not to exist. Merchants were using the post, lawyers were using the post, gentlemen were using the post, and the postmasters, who were chronically underpaid by the Crown, were happy to supplement their income by carrying private letters for whatever fees they could negotiate. The question of whether to formalize this situation, to acknowledge officially that the postal routes were available for private use, and to establish a regular rate for the carriage of private letters, was debated in the early decades of the 16th century with the thoroughness that English officials brought to questions of administrative organization. There were arguments on both sides. Formalizing private use would generate revenue for the Crown, which was perennially short of money. It would provide a service that was clearly in demand, but it would also require a more elaborate administrative structure, more staff, more supervision, more accounting, and it risked diluting the core function of the posts as an instrument of government communication. The resolution of this debate was characteristic of English institutional development, not a decisive break with the past, but a gradual extension of existing practice into new territory. In the year 1635, under the reign of Charles I, a royal proclamation was issued that formally established a public postal service in England, operating alongside and using the infrastructure of the existing royal posts. Letters from private individuals could now be officially sent through the post at rates established by the Crown, to be delivered to any town on the main postal routes. The rates established in 1635 were modest, but not trivial. A single letter traveling up to 80 miles from London cost 2 pence. A letter traveling between 80 and 140 miles cost 4 pence. A letter traveling beyond 140 miles cost 6 pence. For Scotland and Ireland, the rates were higher. These prices were expressed in Old English currency, a system of pounds, shillings, and pence, whose complexity would itself become a significant factor in the history of the Postal Service, since calculating charges based on distance and the number of sheets of paper in a letter required a degree of arithmetical capability that not every postal clerk could reliably manage. The mechanism by which the public post operated in these early decades was relatively straightforward, though it contained within it several features that would cause difficulty for many years. A person wishing to send a letter would write it, fold it, seal it with wax, and address it on the outside. They would then take it to the nearest post office. In London, there were several. In the provinces, there was usually one per town, housed in whatever building the local postmaster happened to occupy. The letter would be weighed and measured, the charge calculated, and the letter handed over. The charge was usually not paid by the sender, but the recipient. The person who received the letter paid the postal rate when the letter was delivered to them. This arrangement of recipient-paid postage was, from a purely practical standpoint, sensible enough. It meant that the Postal Service was paid before it released the letter, preventing the problem of delivering a letter and then being unable to collect the fee from a recipient who was out or who refused to pay or who could not afford the charge. But it also created difficulties that would become increasingly apparent over the following 2 centuries. It meant that people could refuse to accept letters and thereby avoid paying for them, a problem that became acute as postal rates increased. It meant that a letter was of certain financial value at the moment of delivery, not at the moment of posting, which complicated the accounting of the postal system considerably. And it meant that sending a letter was, in a very real sense, placing a financial burden on the person you were writing to, which had complex social implications in an era when many people lived close to the margins of economic survival. The decade of the 1630s and 40s was, of course, also the decade of the English Civil War, a conflict that disrupted virtually every aspect of English institutional life. The postal system was not exempt from this disruption. Routes were interrupted, postmasters changed their loyalties as the military situation shifted. The movement of letters, already imperfect in peacetime, became genuinely unreliable during the years of active fighting. Both the royalist and parliamentary sides tried to maintain their own postal communications with varying success, and the ordinary traffic of private correspondence was at times all but suspended. The interregnum, the years between the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the restoration of Charles II in 1660, was, from a postal history perspective, a period of significant, if somewhat chaotic, development. The Commonwealth government recognized the importance of a reliable postal system, both for its own administrative purposes and as a source of revenue. A succession of officials took responsibility for the posts during this period, among them John Manley and Edmund Prideaux, who attempted with mixed success to consolidate and regularize the system under parliamentary authority. One development of this period deserves particular mention, not because it was immediately significant, but because it contained the seed of something important. A London merchant named William Dockwra, whose story properly belongs to a later decade, was not yet on the scene, but the concept of a local urban postal service delivering letters within a single city rather than between cities was beginning to be discussed. London was already one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population of several 100,000 people, and the problem of moving letters between different parts of the city, between a merchant's counting house in the city and his correspondence office in Westminster, for example, was a real and practical one that the national postal system was not designed to address. The end of the Civil War period brought with it a systematic attempt to reorganize the postal administration. In 1657, Parliament passed an act establishing a general post office for the first time, with a single official at its head responsible for the entire system. This act is often cited as the true founding moment of the British Post Office as a national institution, distinct from the earlier royal posts, which had served primarily as an instrument of the Crown. This act established rates, defined routes, and created the administrative structure that would be built upon and modified in the years that followed. By the time of the Restoration in 1660, England had a postal service that was recognizably a public institution, imperfect, limited in its geographic reach, chronically underfunded, staffed by men of even capability, and subject to the disruptions of weather, bad roads, and political upheaval. But it existed. It connected London to the provinces and the provinces to each other along the main roads. It charged established rates and kept, with varying degrees of accuracy, accounts of what it received. And it was growing, slowly, unsteadily, but growing nonetheless, toward the comprehensive national network that the following centuries would create.
The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought with it a renewed royal interest in the postal system, partly from a genuine desire to improve government communications, and partly, perhaps principally, from an interest in the revenue that a well-managed postal service could generate for the Crown. Charles II was chronically short of money, a condition that afflicted most 17th-century English monarchs, and the postal service, if properly managed, represented a steady and predictable source of income. Letters were being sent in ever greater numbers. Trade was expanding. The country was growing more connected, more commercial, more literate. All of this meant more letters, and more letters meant more revenue. In 1660, Charles issued a new Post Office Act that consolidated and extended the legislation of the interregnum period. The act confirmed the General Post Office as the sole legal carrier of letters between towns in England, a monopoly that was commercially significant, since it prevented private carriers from competing for the letter trade on the main routes. It established the office of Postmaster General as the political head of the system, a position that would remain the senior postal appointment for the next 2.5 centuries, and it set out a schedule of postal rates that was somewhat more systematic, if no less complicated, than what had existed before. The man appointed as the first Postmaster General under the new dispensation was Henry Bishop, who held the position from 1660 to 1663. Bishop's tenure is remembered in postal history primarily for one small but lasting innovation, the Bishop mark. This was a small circular stamp applied to letters by postal clerks, showing the month and day on which the letter had been posted. It was the first standardized date stamp in postal history, the distant ancestor of the postmarks that appear on letters and parcels to this day. Bishop introduced it for a practical administrative reason.
It allowed the post office to demonstrate, in cases of dispute, that delays in delivery were not the fault of the Postal Service, but of the sender or the road conditions. If a letter was posted on the 5th and not delivered until the 12th, the bishop mark on the letter proved when the post office had first received it. It is characteristic of postal history that this innovation, one of the most enduring in the entire story of the British Post Office, was introduced not as a grand gesture or policy decision, but as a practical response to a specific operational problem. The history of the post office is full of such small practical responses to small practical problems, each one leaving behind some small change in procedure or equipment that became over time a standard feature of the system. The accumulated weight of all these small changes is what the history of the post office actually consists of when you look at it closely. It is not a history of dramatic moments or revolutionary decisions, but a history of incremental adaptation, of procedures being adjusted, forms being redesigned, rates being recalculated, routes being extended, staff being reorganized in response to the continuous low-level pressure of a growing institution meeting an expanding demand. The routes available to postal travelers in the 1660s were still concentrated on the main roads leading out of London. The Great North Road remained the most important and most heavily used. The Bristol Road carried the western mail. The roads through Kent served the southeast. The road through Exeter began to extend toward the southwestern extremity of the country. But large areas of England, particularly in the north and west, and virtually the whole of Wales beyond a few main roads, remained effectively outside the postal network. A letter addressed to a recipient in a village even a few miles off the main road might take days to reach its destination by informal means, carried by a neighbor or a servant making the journey on foot or horseback. The problem of the last mile, or in some cases the last 20 miles, was one that the postal system would grapple with throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The infrastructure of fixed stations along main roads worked well enough for the movement of letters between the principal towns on those roads. But England was not primarily a country of great roads and principal towns. It was a country of small villages, dispersed farms, country houses set back from main roads by long private drives, market towns connected to the main road network only by secondary lanes that became impassable in wet weather. Getting a letter from the post town to its final recipient in this dispersed landscape was a problem that required local, informal, highly variable solutions. In some areas, local arrangements existed by which a carrier or messenger would collect letters from the post office in the nearest town and distribute them to recipients in the surrounding villages, charging a small additional fee for this service. In other areas, recipients were expected to collect their own letters from the post office, which meant receiving a letter required a journey to the post town, a journey that for many people in rural areas was not trivial. In the cities, letter carriers were employed to deliver letters within the urban area, walking their rounds through the streets and courts and lanes of the city with their bags of correspondence. The cost of postage during this period continued to be borne by the recipient rather than the sender. The rates were calculated according to a complex schedule that took account of the distance traveled and the number of sheets of paper contained in the letter, since a letter of 2 sheets of paper was counted as 2 separate letters for charging purposes, and a letter with an enclosure required an additional charge. This system was simple enough in principle, but extremely complex in practice, since it required the postal clerk at the point of delivery to assess the content of the letter, or at least its physical characteristics, and calculate the appropriate charge before releasing it to the recipient. The result was a system of charging that was, by any objective assessment, quite difficult to use. Senders could not easily know in advance what their letter would cost the recipient. Recipients could not easily know whether the charge presented to them was correct. Disputes were frequent. Evasions were common. People wrote on the outside of a letter or used the thinnest possible paper to reduce the weight and bulk of their correspondence. The complexity of the charging system was, in a sense, a tax on literacy, and it was felt most heavily by those who could least afford it. In the 1680s, a development occurred that would eventually be seen as a significant moment in the history of urban postal services. A merchant named William Dockwra, together with a partner named Robert Murray, established what they called the London Penny Post in the year 1680. This was a private enterprise operating entirely within the City of London. It did not connect to the national network at all, and it charged a flat rate of 1 penny for the delivery of any letter anywhere within the London area. Letters could be deposited at one of several hundred receiving shops scattered throughout the city, and they would be collected several times a day and delivered to their destinations within a few hours. The London Penny Post was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement of private enterprise. Within a few years of its establishment, it was handling hundreds of thousands of letters per year. The flat-rate penny charge was simple to understand and simple to pay. The multiple daily collections and deliveries gave Londoners a communication service of genuinely impressive speed and reliability. It was possible in the 1880s to write a letter in the morning and have a reply back by afternoon, something that the National Post, with its schedules of once-daily departures on fixed routes, could not approach. The post office viewed Dockwra's enterprise with the mixture of admiration and alarm that established institutions typically feel when confronted with innovative competition. In 1682, the post office successfully sued Dockwra for infringement of its statutory monopoly on letter carrying, and the London Penny Post was taken over by the state. Dockwra himself received a modest pension by way of compensation, which was perhaps more generous than he might have expected from an institution he had embarrassed. The London Penny Post continued to operate under government control, and the infrastructure Dockwra had created, the network of receiving houses, the system of multiple daily deliveries, the simple flat-rate charge, became the foundation of the urban delivery network that the post office would develop and extend over the following century. The late 17th century also saw the beginning of a long and significant improvement in the roads of England. The road network that existed in 1660 was, in many places, barely adequate for the volume of traffic it was required to carry. The main postal routes were better maintained than most, since the government had an obvious interest in keeping them passable, but even they could become dangerously difficult in bad weather. The introduction of turnpike trusts, bodies empowered by Act of Parliament to charge tolls on stretches of road and use the revenue to maintain and improve the surface, began in the 1660s and would accelerate dramatically over the following century. The improvement of the roads was not merely a convenience for travelers. It was a direct enabler of faster and more reliable postal communication. A post rider on a good road could maintain speeds that were impossible on a rough one. A mail coach, when coaches began to be used for the post, could carry a heavier load and travel farther in a day on an improved surface. The history of the Postal Service and the history of the English road network are, in this period, deeply intertwined, each development in one creating conditions for development in the other. By 1720, England had a postal system of genuine national significance. It connected London to every substantial town in the country by a network of routes, though coverage in more remote areas remained patchy. It handled a growing volume of private correspondence as rising literacy and expanding commerce created an ever larger population of people with letters to send and letters to receive. It provided a regular and relatively reliable service that merchants, lawyers, government officials, and increasingly ordinary people depended upon for the conduct of their daily affairs. And it generated, for the Crown and later for the government, a substantial and growing stream of revenue from postal charges. It was imperfect in numerous ways. The rates were complex, the coverage was incomplete, the staff were of variable quality and often underpaid. The corruption that infected much of early modern government was not absent from the postal administration. Letters were sometimes opened by agents of the state. The practice of intercepting mail for intelligence purposes was, in this era, not merely permitted, but actively practiced. And the physical infrastructure of the system, the horses, the roads, the staging posts, the sorting houses, required constant maintenance and frequent investment. But for all its imperfections, the post office of 1720 was recognizably the ancestor of the institution that would, a century and a half later, become one of the great achievements of Victorian public administration. The foundations were in place, the habits were established, the need was growing. The story of how those foundations were built upon and those habits refined and that need met, or at least approached, occupies the next century and a half of this history.
Before we move into the age of the mail coach, it is worth pausing for a moment in the quiet world of the provincial post office of the late 17th century, because it is here, in the mundane daily operations of the smaller postal establishments of England, that the true texture of the system is most visible. The typical post office in a provincial English town of 1680 or 1700 was not a grand building with pillared frontage and brass fittings. It was, most often, a room in the postmaster's house, or a corner of the inn that the postmaster also operated, or a space at the back of a shop. The distinction between the postmaster's postal duties and his other commercial activities was not always clear, and this was not considered problematic. The postmaster was understood to be a local man of business who added postal responsibilities to whatever else occupied him, rather than a dedicated civil servant whose entire professional identity was defined by his postal function. The letters that arrived at a provincial post office, typically once a day from London, on the days when the post ran, were sorted by the postmaster or his clerk into the various piles for local delivery or onward forwarding. The sorting was done by hand, with each letter being examined for its address and directed to the appropriate pile. The addresses on letters of this period were sometimes models of precision, a street, a house number, a town, a county, and sometimes deeply approximate, a person described only by their name and the name of their village, or by their trade,
or by some informal designation that depended on the local postmaster's personal knowledge of who was who in the district. A letter addressed to Mr. John Harrison, the ironmonger, somewhere near Shrewsbury, was not an unusual form of address in the late 17th century, and the ability to deliver such a letter depended entirely on the postmaster's knowledge of his locality. The postmaster in a small town knew, or tried to know, who everyone in his district was, where they lived, and what they did. This knowledge was part of the informal infrastructure of the postal system, a kind of human index that existed in the heads of the people who ran the post offices, without which the physical machinery of routes and horses and bags would have been unable to deliver anything at all. The delivery of letters to recipients in the countryside around a post town was, as we have noted, a persistent problem. The formal postal service delivered letters to the post towns, but the last stage of the journey, from the post town to the recipient's door, was managed by whatever informal arrangement the locality had developed. In some areas, a local carrier made regular journeys between the post town and the surrounding villages, and letters could be entrusted to him for a small additional charge. In other areas, the recipients of letters were expected to send a servant or messenger to the post town to collect whatever mail had arrived for them. For the gentry and the more prosperous classes, the problem was manageable. They had servants to send on these errands, and the post town was likely to be within reasonable riding distance of the country house. For ordinary working people, it was more difficult. A farm laborer or a cottage weaver who expected a letter from a distant relative had, in many cases, to make the journey to the post town themselves, which might mean half a day's walking, at a time when half a day's walking was half a day's wages lost. The receipt of a letter for such people was a genuine event that required a real effort and a real cost. This difficulty was partly addressed in the larger towns by the employment of bellmen or criers, whose job was to go about the streets announcing that letters had arrived for various named recipients. The bellman was, in effect, a human notification system. He walked his circuit, calling out the names on the letters in his bag, and recipients who heard their name called would come out to collect their correspondence and pay the postage. It was a system that depended on the recipient being within earshot, and it worked better in dense urban neighborhoods than in rural communities, but it was a genuine attempt to solve the problem of getting letters from the post office to their intended recipients without requiring each recipient to come to the office in person. The financial arrangements between the post office and its provincial employees throughout this period were a source of considerable complexity and occasional friction. Postmasters were paid a combination of salary and fees, the latter calculated on the volume of mail they handled. The salary component was small and the fee component variable, which meant that the income of a postmaster depended partly on factors outside his control: the volume of postal traffic through his town, which reflected the general level of commercial and personal correspondence in the district. A postmaster in a prosperous market town with active commercial traffic might earn a comfortable living from his postal fees. A postmaster in a small and quiet village might earn very little. The accounts kept by provincial post offices in this period were often imprecise. The post office in London required regular accounts showing how much money had been received in postage and how much had been paid out in expenses. But the mechanisms for checking these accounts were limited, and the opportunities for small-scale financial irregularity were real. Postmasters who underreported their receipts or overclaimed their expenses were not unknown, and the post office's ability to detect and punish such irregularities was constrained by the practical difficulty of auditing operations scattered across hundreds of locations throughout the country. The roads that carried the postal traffic of this period were, even after the improvements of the early turnpike era, often in poor condition by modern standards. The surface of an English road in 1690 was typically a mixture of compacted earth, gravel where it was available, and whatever material had been deposited by the passage of hooves and wheels over decades of use. In dry weather and light traffic, such roads were adequate. In wet weather or under heavy use, they became rutted, muddy, and in the worst cases, effectively impassable. The winters of the late 17th and early 18th century were often severe. This was the period of the Little Ice Age, when temperatures across northern Europe were consistently lower than they would be in the 19th century. And the condition of the roads in January and February could make postal communication genuinely unreliable. A letter sent in December from London to a recipient in Cumberland might not arrive until February if the roads in the north were blocked by snow. A letter sent to a correspondent in a low-lying area of the country might be delayed by flooding that made the road literally impassable. The post office was aware of these seasonal constraints and tried to maintain service through all conditions, but the forces of weather were, in this era, more powerful than any administrative determination, and delays caused by road conditions were simply accepted as an inevitable feature of the postal system. The postal year had its own rhythms, shaped by the seasons and the agricultural calendar. The heaviest mail traffic occurred in the autumn, when the harvest had been gathered and the accounts of agricultural transactions were being settled, when the great fairs and markets of the year had generated their correspondence, when the gentry were returning from their country houses to London for the beginning of the political and social season. The quietest period was typically the deep winter, when travel was most difficult and the volume of business correspondence fell with the fall in commercial activity. The post office managed its staffing and its horse supplies with some awareness of these seasonal patterns, though the flexibility of the system was limited by the fixed nature of its infrastructure. It is against this background, the slow horses, the muddy roads, the imprecise accounts, the provincial postmasters managing their letter rooms in the back of their shops or inns, that the mail coach revolution of the 1780s must be understood. The change it represented was not merely of speed, though speed was important. It was a change in the fundamental character of the postal service, from a system that was variable, informal, and shaped by local conditions, to one that was systematic, scheduled, and governed by standards set and enforced from London. The mail coach was not merely a faster way of carrying letters. It was the beginning of the post office as a genuinely national institution operating to uniform standards across the entire country. Part 4. Horses, Roads, and the Mail Coach Revolution, 1720 to 1784. The middle decades of the 18th century were, from the perspective of postal history, a period of consolidation rather than dramatic change. The system established in the late 17th century continued to develop in the same general directions, expanding coverage, growing volume, gradually improving reliability, but without any single transformative event to mark a clear break from what had gone before. This is, of course, precisely the kind of period that makes for the most satisfying sleep, and so we will give it the attention it deserves. The postal routes of England in 1720 still depended primarily on mounted riders, men on horseback, who carried the mail bags along the established routes between fixed stations. This method had changed relatively little since the reign of Henry VIII, though the horses were better bred, the roads somewhat improved, and the administrative machinery considerably more elaborate than it had been 2 centuries earlier. The mounted post rider was, by this period, a familiar and unremarkable figure in the English countryside, a man in a leather satchel, carrying the nation's correspondence through all weathers, at a pace determined by the condition of the road and the quality of his horse. The bags he carried were a heterogeneous collection. There were official dispatches from government departments, carefully sealed and marked with the seals of their respective offices. There were letters from merchants to their agents concerning shipments of wool and cloth and grain, bills of exchange and letters of credit, instructions for the purchase and sale of goods. There were legal documents, circular letters, invoices, bills, notifications of births and deaths and marriages. The mailbag was, in a very real sense, a compressed record of the social and commercial life of the country, all of it moving along the road at the speed of a horse.
One of the enduring problems of the early 18th century post was the practice known as by-letter traffic, letters passing between 2 towns that were not in the same postal direction from London. If a merchant in Bristol wished to write to a colleague in Norfolk, his letter had to travel first to London, then north and east to Norfolk, a journey of considerably greater distance than the direct route between the 2 cities. This was because the postal network was designed as a series of routes radiating from London, not as a grid connecting different provincial centers directly. The result was that the journey of a letter between 2 provincial towns often took considerably longer and cost considerably more than the direct geography of the situation seemed to require. The post office was aware of this problem and made periodic efforts to address it by establishing cross posts, routes connecting provincial towns to each other without routing through London. The extension of the cross-post network was a slow and somewhat irregular process, since it required the appointment of new postmasters, the establishment of new stations, the negotiation of new rates, and the creation of new administrative arrangements. Progress was made, but the system of cross-posts remained incomplete and inconsistent throughout the first half of the 18th century. A letter sent between 2 major provincial cities might travel directly if a convenient cross-post route existed. If not, it might take the long way round through London, arriving days later than necessary. The growth of London itself was a major factor in the development of the postal system during this period. By 1750, London had a population of something over 600,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world, and the volume of correspondence generated by this population and by the commercial, legal, and governmental activities concentrated in the capital was immense. The London District Post, the descendant of Dockwra's penny post, was handling hundreds of thousands of letters per year and struggling to keep pace with the demand. The expansion of the district post required the hiring of more letter carriers, the opening of more receiving houses where letters could be deposited, and the addition of more daily collections and deliveries. By the middle of the 18th century, London had several deliveries of letters per day, with letters arriving at receiving houses being collected and sorted and delivered within a few hours of their deposit. This was not, by modern standards, particularly fast. The city was large, the streets crowded and confusing, the letter carriers proceeding on foot through neighborhoods whose geography they had to memorize in detail. But it was a genuine service that Londoners relied upon and valued.
The letter carrier who walked the streets of 18th century London was a recognizable figure in the urban landscape, a man in a distinctive uniform, if his employer could afford it, carrying a leather bag and working his way methodically through his round. He knew the streets of his district intimately. He knew which houses were occupied and which were vacant, which recipients were reliable payers of postage and which were difficult, where the courts and alleys ran that did not appear on any map. He was, in his way, a kind of urban atlas, carrying in his head a detailed knowledge of the physical fabric of a section of the largest city in the world. The condition of the roads outside London improved significantly during the middle decades of the 18th century, driven by the expansion of the turnpike trust system. The turnpike trusts, local bodies of trustees empowered to levy tolls and use the revenue for road maintenance, spread rapidly across England during the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, transforming significant stretches of previously impassable road into surfaces on which wheeled vehicles could travel with reasonable safety and at reasonable speed. The improvement was uneven. Some trusts were well managed and made real improvements, others were inefficient and wasted their toll revenue, but the overall trajectory was clearly toward better roads. Better roads made faster travel possible, and faster travel meant for the postal system the possibility of using wheeled vehicles rather than horses for the carriage of mail. A coach could carry far more letters than a mounted rider. It could also carry passengers who would pay fares that could supplement the postal revenue. And it could travel on a good road at speeds comparable or even exceeding those of a mounted rider making the same journey. The great breakthrough came in the year 1784, when a Bristol theater owner and occasional postal reformer named John Palmer persuaded the government to allow him to operate a mail coach service between Bristol and London. Palmer's proposal was not entirely original. The idea of using coaches for the mail had been discussed before, but he was the first person to demonstrate it successfully on a major route. His coach left Bristol in the afternoon of the 2nd of August, 1784, arrived in London the following morning, and the postal world was changed. Palmer's innovation was not simply the use of a coach instead of a horse. It was the whole system he designed around the coach. The coach traveled fast, faster than a mounted rider on the same road, because the road had been improved by the turnpikes, and the coach could maintain a steady trot over long distances without the fluctuations in pace that a single horse and rider experienced. It traveled on a strict schedule, departing and arriving at set times, which made the service predictable in a way that the mounted post had never been. It carried an armed guard whose job was to protect the mails from highway robbery, a more real and present threat than the modern imagination easily appreciates. And it stopped only briefly at the staging posts along the route, just long enough to change horses and pick up or drop off mail bags, then pressed on without delay.
The mail coach guard deserves a moment of attention, for he was one of the more distinctive figures in 18th century English life. He sat at the rear of the coach on a seat exposed to the elements, with the leather mail bags secured in the boot beneath him, and a blunderbuss and a brace of pistols close to hand. He wore a distinctive uniform, red coat, gold braid, a hat of impressive formality that identified him as an officer of the post office. He carried a timepiece provided by the post office and was responsible for ensuring that the coach kept to its schedule. At each stopping point, he would hand over the local mail bag and collect the next, sign his name in the waybill that recorded the progress of the mail,
and give the signal for departure. The guard was responsible for the mails in a way that the driver of the coach was not. The driver was simply a coachman hired for his ability with horses, but the guard was an officer of the crown, and the safe arrival of the mail was his personal responsibility. If the coach was delayed by snow or flooding or a broken axle, it was the guard's duty to find another way of getting the mails through, on horseback if necessary, on foot if there was no other option. The post office was not sympathetic to excuses, and the guard who arrived without the mail faced consequences that concentrated the mind wonderfully. The introduction of mail coaches was not universally welcomed. The contractors who had been supplying horses and riders for the mounted post had a financial interest in the old system. Postmasters, whose income derived partly from the care of post horses, were less certain of their position under the new regime. And there were those who simply distrusted innovation, who felt that a system that had worked for 200 years did not need the attentions of a Bristol theater owner to improve it. But the results were undeniable. The mail coach was faster, more reliable, and more secure than the mounted post. Within a few years of Palmer's initial experiment, mail coaches had been established on most of the principal routes out of London. The Great North Road, the Bristol Road, the Bath Road, the road through Exeter, all were served by mail coaches running to tight schedules with their red-coated guards and their blunderbusses and their determination to arrive on time.
The years between 1784 and 1840 were a period of considerable strain for the British Post Office. The mail coach system that John Palmer had introduced was working well. The coaches were fast and reliable. The schedules were kept. The mail arrived on time more often than not. But the post office was facing challenges that had nothing to do with the speed of delivery. The challenges were financial and administrative, and they went to the heart of how the postal system was organized and funded. The postal rates of the late 18th century were, by any reasonable assessment, punishingly high. A single letter traveling from London to a destination more than 300 miles away cost more than a shilling, a significant sum for most people, equivalent to several hours of a working man's wages. The complex rate schedule, which varied by distance and by the number of sheets of paper in the letter, meant that the cost of sending or receiving a letter was unpredictable and potentially very large. The result was that letter writing remained a luxury that many people, perhaps most people, could not afford on any regular basis. The response to high postal rates was creative and widespread. People avoided official postal channels wherever possible. They sent letters by private carriers, by coaches, by any traveler going in the right direction. They wrote on very thin paper and used every inch of the available surface, including the margins and even across lines already written, to pack as much text as possible into a single sheet. They used prearranged codes. If the letter arrived safely, that was news enough. The recipient could read the address and know that the sender was well, without paying to open the letter at all. The practice of receiving a letter and then refusing to pay for it, returning it to the carrier and foregoing the information it contained, was a genuine problem. Postal rates were due at delivery, not at posting,
and a recipient who did not want to pay the charge could simply decline the letter. This was sometimes done fraudulently. A person might arrange with their correspondent to include information in the address or the seal that conveyed a pre-agreed message so that the information could be read without paying to open the letter. The post office was aware of this practice, but could do little to prevent it without examining the outside of every letter, which would have been both impractical and improper. The revenue consequences of high rates were paradoxical. By charging so much for each letter, the post office was suppressing the total volume of correspondence and thereby suppressing its own income. A lower rate would generate more traffic, and more traffic might generate greater total revenue even at the lower price per letter. This logic, that a lower price, by generating greater volume, could produce greater total revenue, was not new in economic thinking, but its application to the postal system was worked out in detail in the late 1780s and early 1800s by a number of reformers who were increasingly convinced that the existing rate structure was both unfair and economically irrational.
The most important of these reformers was a schoolmaster and educational theorist named Rowland Hill, whose contribution to the history of the post office was so significant that it is difficult to overstate it. Hill published a pamphlet in 1837 titled Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability, in which he laid out with extraordinary clarity and thoroughness the case for a radical simplification and reduction of postal rates. Hill's argument rested on a careful analysis of the actual cost structure of the Postal Service. He pointed out that the overwhelming majority of the cost of carrying a letter was incurred not in the transportation of the letter itself, which was a trivially small fraction of the total weight of a mail coach or its cargo, but in the collection, sorting, and delivery of individual letters at either end of the journey. The actual cost difference between carrying a letter from London to Edinburgh and carrying it from London to Brighton was, he argued, negligible. The elaborate distance-based rate schedule was therefore not reflecting any real difference in costs, but was simply a legacy of an earlier era when horses and road conditions made distance a genuine cost factor. If the cost of transportation was essentially the same regardless of distance, then a uniform rate, the same charge for any letter regardless of where it was going within the United Kingdom, was both simpler and fairer than the existing complex schedule. And if that uniform rate was set low enough, Hill proposed a penny per letter, it would bring the cost of postal communication within the reach of ordinary people for the first time, dramatically increasing the volume of correspondence and, he predicted, generating more total revenue than the high rates it replaced. The argument was compelling. It was also, for the existing post office establishment, deeply threatening. The post office officials who were asked to comment on Hill's proposals were almost uniformly hostile. They doubted his calculations. They challenged his assumptions about the elasticity of demand for postal services. They were professionally invested in the existing system, which they had spent careers learning to administer, and they resented the implication that a schoolmaster had seen a fundamental flaw that had escaped their notice. But the public response to Hill's pamphlet was enthusiastic, and the political pressure for reform was building. In 1839, Parliament passed legislation authorizing the introduction of the penny post, and on the 10th of January 1840 it came into effect. Any letter not exceeding half an ounce in weight could be sent to any destination in the United Kingdom for 1 penny, paid in advance by the sender. The prepayment requirement was itself a significant innovation. For more than 3 centuries, postal charges had been collected at delivery.
The shift to prepayment by the sender removed the problem of refused letters, simplified the accounting at the delivery end, and, crucially, required a means by which the prepayment could be demonstrated. The solution to this problem was the adhesive postage stamp, a small piece of gummed paper that could be purchased at a post office, affixed to the letter, and would then be canceled at posting as evidence that the charge had been paid. The design of this stamp, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, is one of the small, indelible images of Victorian England. It was printed in black, hence its popular name, the penny black. It showed a portrait of the young Queen Victoria, whose head would appear on British stamps for the following 60 decades, in profile against a dark background, surrounded by an intricate engine-turned border. It was small, about the size of a fingernail, and it was, in its quiet way, revolutionary. The introduction of the penny post and the postage stamp transformed the British postal system almost overnight. The volume of letters increased dramatically. Within a year, it had more than doubled, and it continued to grow for years afterward. People who had never been able to afford to correspond now could. The letters of working people, letters between family members separated by migration or employment, letters between the poor and the less poor, letters that had previously never existed because the cost of sending them was prohibitive, began to flow through the postal system in quantities that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. The post office itself struggled initially to cope with this volume. The sorting offices were overwhelmed. The letter carriers could not keep pace with the deliveries. The system that had been designed for a certain level of traffic was suddenly required to handle double and then triple and eventually 10 times that volume. New sorting offices were built, new staff were hired, new procedures were introduced. The infrastructure of the post office was expanded and adapted over the course of the 1840s and 1850s to match the new reality of a postal service that was truly universal, used by everyone for everything.
The years following the introduction of the penny post were, for the British Post Office, a period of extraordinary growth and transformation. The institution that emerged from the Victorian reforms of the 1840s was recognizably different from the one that had entered them. Larger, more complex, more professional, more thoroughly embedded in the daily life of the country, and operating at a scale that would have been inconceivable to the postmasters of Henry VIII's era. The sheer volume of letters handled by the post office grew with a regularity that was, in its own way, one of the most remarkable statistical phenomena of the Victorian age. In the year before the introduction of the penny post, the post office handled approximately 75 million letters. By 1850, the annual figure had risen to about 300 million. By 1860, it exceeded 500 million. By 1880, it was approaching 1 billion. These numbers are not merely impressive in themselves. They are an index of a transformation in the habits of daily life, as writing letters became, for the first time, something that ordinary people did routinely rather than occasionally or never. The physical infrastructure required to handle this volume was substantial. The central sorting office for London, the Mount Pleasant office, which would remain a fixture of the capital's postal geography, was expanded repeatedly during the Victorian period, eventually occupying an enormous complex of buildings that employed hundreds of sorters working in shifts around the clock. The provinces had their own sorting offices, staffed by clerks who had committed to memory the extraordinarily complex geography of British addresses, the thousands of towns and villages, the streets and lanes and courts and closes, the country houses with their proper names and their obscure locations.
The work of a postal sorter in the Victorian era was one of the more demanding forms of skilled manual labor in existence. A competent sorter was expected to sort letters by destination at a speed of around 60 letters per minute, 1 per second, without error. This required not merely knowledge, but the transformation of knowledge into reflex, a kind of muscular memory that allowed the hands to work faster than conscious thought. Sorters were tested and timed, and their performance was measured against established standards. The post office was, in this respect, an early example of the systematic measurement of worker productivity that would become a defining feature of industrial organization and of the particular form of controlled, repetitive, high-speed manual work that the Industrial Revolution made both possible and necessary. The letter carriers who delivered the sorted mail to their recipients were, by the Victorian period, a familiar and generally respected figure in British street life. They wore a distinctive uniform, in the early Victorian period a scarlet coat that earned them the nickname the Red Men or the Postmen, and carried a distinctive leather bag. They worked their rounds systematically, street by street and house by house, with a precise knowledge of their territory that came from years of daily repetition. In London, the busiest letter carriers might make several deliveries per day, since the volume of mail arriving at the sorting office was sufficient to fill multiple delivery cycles. The working conditions of letter carriers in the mid-Victorian period were, by modern standards, quite demanding. They were on their feet for most of the working day, walking considerable distances through city streets or country lanes, regardless of weather. Their pay was modest. A London letter carrier in the 1850s earned perhaps 15 shillings a week, which was a working wage but not a comfortable one. The post office expected a high standard of conduct. Letter carriers were forbidden to accept gifts from recipients, a rule that was acknowledged to be frequently broken, required to account for every letter in their bag, and subject to dismissal for any failure of honesty or reliability. The expansion of the railway network during the 1830s and 40s had a profound effect on the postal system. The railways could move mail faster than any other method. A train traveling at 50 or 60 miles per hour left the mail coach, for all its improvements, far behind. The post office was quick to recognize the potential and to negotiate arrangements with the railway companies for the carriage of mail. By the 1840s, the majority of the long-distance mail between major towns was traveling by rail. The most significant innovation in railway mail was the traveling post office, a specially equipped railway carriage in which postal workers sorted letters in transit so that the mail was ready for local delivery as soon as it arrived at its destination. The operation of a traveling post office was, from a technical standpoint, impressive. The carriage was fitted with sorting racks, pigeonholes for different destinations, a stove for warmth in winter, and a lamp for work at night. The postal workers who staffed it had to manage the movement of the train while sorting at speed, bracing themselves against the sway and vibration while maintaining their performance standards. They also operated a mechanical apparatus, the apparatus for exchanging mail bags with stations without stopping, so that even towns not on the direct route could receive and dispatch mail without the train slowing.
The railway mail also carried with it an increased security concern. A mail coach traveling at 10 miles per hour was relatively easy to rob. The highwaymen who had preyed on coaches in the 18th century were a real phenomenon, not merely a romantic fiction. A train traveling at 50 miles per hour was effectively impossible to rob in transit, which was one of the incidental security benefits of the new technology.
But the concentration of large quantities of valuable mail on a single train also created new vulnerabilities, a single point of failure that could result in the loss of an enormous quantity of correspondence. The post office of the mid-Victorian period was also, increasingly, an employer of women. The telegraph service, which the post office took over from private companies in 1870, employed large numbers of female telegraphists, women who had learned to operate the Morse code equipment and who worked in the telegraph rooms of post offices across the country. The employment of women as counter clerks in post offices, selling stamps, weighing parcels, issuing money orders, also expanded during this period, as the post office discovered that women could perform these tasks reliably and at a lower wage than men. This employment of women was, in its way, a significant social development. The Victorian post office was one of the first large employers in Britain to offer respectable office employment to middle-class women, employment that was considered suitable for educated women who needed to earn their own living, which was a category that expanded as the century progressed. The post office counter clerk, in her neat dress and her professional composure, was a figure that appeared in the daily life of Victorian towns across the country, as familiar in her way as the letter carrier who had preceded her on the morning round. The money order service, which the post office had offered since 1838, became an increasingly important part of the institution's social role during the Victorian period. The money order allowed a person to send money through the post securely. The sender paid the amount plus a small commission at one post office, and the recipient could collect the same amount at another. This was particularly useful for remittances between family members, a son working in a city sending money home to parents in the country, or an emigrant sending funds back from the colonies. The volume of money orders issued grew steadily through the Victorian period, and the service became an important link in the financial life of families separated by the geography of industrialization and empire. The last 3 decades of the 19th century saw the British Post Office reach a condition of institutional maturity that was, in many respects, a culmination of the 4 centuries of development traced in this history. The postal system of 1890 was not the same institution as the royal posts of 1516 in any obvious sense. The technology was different, the scale was incomparably larger, the social function was entirely transformed. But there was a continuity of purpose and organization that ran from Henry VIII's posting stations to the Victorian sorting offices, a continuous line of institutional development that made the later system the organic descendant of the earlier one. The introduction of the parcel post in 1880 was a development that extended the post office's reach into a new dimension of commercial life. Before 1880, the post office carried only letters and printed matter, objects that could be sent through the letter post. Parcels, packages too large or heavy to be treated as letters, had to be sent through the railway companies or through private carriers. The establishment of a parcel post brought the carriage of small packages within the post office's remit, allowing people to send goods through the mail as well as messages. The parcel post changed the relationship between the post office and the commercial world. Retailers could now send goods directly to customers through the mail. Mail order businesses, firms that took orders by post and delivered goods by post, became possible and then common. the catalog of a mail-order company arriving through the letterbox, opening up a range of goods that might not be available in the local shops, became a feature of both urban and rural life in the last decades of the 19th century. The postal order, introduced in 1881, was a simpler and cheaper alternative to the money order for small sums. Where the money order was a complex instrument requiring paperwork at both ends, the postal order was a printed form that could be purchased at any post office, filled in by the buyer, sent through the post, and cashed at any other post office. The postal order was particularly useful for small transactions, paying a subscription, settling a small debt, sending pocket money to a child away from home, and its simplicity and accessibility made it enormously popular. The volume of postal orders issued within a few years of introduction ran into the hundreds of millions. The savings bank function of the post office, introduced in 1861 under the initiative of the then Postmaster General William Ewart Gladstone, had by the 1880s become one of the significant features of the institution's social role. The Post Office Savings Bank offered ordinary people, particularly working-class people, who might not be welcome at the commercial banks, a safe place to deposit small sums of money, earning a modest rate of interest. The accessibility of the savings bank was its great virtue. With post offices in every town and village in the country, a depositor could open an account and make deposits anywhere and withdraw from any other office.
The growth of the savings bank was remarkable. By 1890, the Post Office Savings Bank held deposits from several million savers, a substantial fraction of the entire population of the United Kingdom, and managed assets of enormous value. The institution had become, in its savings bank function, one of the most important financial institutions in the country, holding the savings of the working and lower middle classes in a way that no commercial bank approached. This was not how anyone had planned it. The savings bank had grown organically from a modest initiative into an institution of national financial significance, in the way that the best postal developments often did. The physical infrastructure of the post office in the 1880s and 1890s was extensive and elaborate. Every town of any size had a post office, usually a substantial building, often purpose-built, designed to project the authority and permanence of the institution it housed. The larger post offices had multiple windows for different services, one for letters and parcels, one for telegrams, one for savings bank transactions, one for money orders and postal orders, one for stamps. The staff behind these windows were trained, uniformed, and subject to the detailed regulations that governed all aspects of post office employment. The telegraph service, which the post office had nationalized in 1870, added another dimension to the institution's role. A telegram, a message sent by telegraph and delivered by hand, offered the speed of communication that even the fastest postal service could not match. A telegram from London could reach Edinburgh in minutes, compared to the several hours required for a letter traveling by the fastest train. The telegraph was the first form of instant long-distance communication in history, and its integration into the post office made that institution in the last 3 decades of the 19th century the provider not only of physical but of electronic communication services. The staff of the post office in the late Victorian period were numerous, diverse, and organized into a complex hierarchy. At the top was the Postmaster General,
a political appointment whose holder sat in the cabinet and was responsible for postal policy. Below him was a secretary who ran the institution on a day-to-day basis. Below the secretary were the headquarters staff in London, responsible for finance, engineering, telegraphs, the savings bank, and the other functions of the central administration. In the regions, surveyors' districts were headed by surveyors, whose job was to oversee the operation of all post offices and postal services within their territory. And in the individual offices, postmasters managed the delivery services, the counter services, and the staff of their particular location. The culture of the post office in the Victorian era was one of considerable formality and strict discipline. Staff were expected to be punctual, honest, accurate, and sober. They were forbidden to discuss post office business outside the office. They were required to maintain the confidentiality of postal matter. The privacy of correspondence was, by the Victorian period, a firmly established principle, and the interception of mail by state agents, which had been a routine practice in the 17th and 18th centuries, was now a matter of public scandal rather than accepted administration. They were subject to a detailed code of conduct that regulated their behavior both in and out of uniform, and breaches of this code were dealt with through a formal disciplinary process. The letter carriers of the late Victorian post office were organized into carefully managed rounds, geographic circuits that each carrier walked day after day, delivering the letters from his bag to their recipients. The design of these rounds was a matter of considerable administrative attention. Too large a round, and the carrier would arrive at distant points too late in the day. Too small, and the carrier's time would be wasted. The optimization of postal rounds, adjusting their geography in response to changes in the volume of mail, the geography of new streets, the shifting concentrations of residential and commercial activity, was an ongoing administrative exercise that occupied the attention of local postmasters throughout the country. The volume of Christmas mail was, by the 1880s, already a significant annual challenge for the postal system. The Victorian Christmas, with its cards, its gifts, its family letters, the new tradition of the Christmas card that had developed since the first commercial cards appeared in the 1840s, generated a surge in postal traffic that required extra staff, extra sorting capacity, and the organization of special delivery arrangements. The Christmas post became, in the late Victorian period, the annual test of the postal system's capacity, a predictable but always somewhat overwhelming demonstration of what the institution was required to do when the country's correspondence came, as it did every December, in an enormous rush.
The postcard, introduced to Britain in 1870 following their success on the continent, added another category of postal communication that grew with remarkable speed. A postcard, a card of standard size bearing a printed address on one side and space for a message on the other, could be sent through the post for a halfpenny rather than the penny charged for letters. The lower price, combined with the convenience of not having to seal an envelope, made the postcard enormously popular for short messages of the kind that did not require the privacy of a sealed letter. By the 1890s, hundreds of millions of postcards were passing through the British postal system each year. The picture postcard, a postcard bearing a photographic or illustrated image, emerged in the 1890s and became the great postal craze of the final years of the Victorian era.
People collected postcards, traded them, sent them from places they visited on holiday, used them to communicate with friends and family in a form that was half message, half memento. The picture postcard industry that developed around this craze involved printers, photographers, artists, and stationers across the country, and the postal system was the medium through which all of this output circulated. It is worth pausing in the final stretch of this history to reflect on what the postal system actually meant to the people who used it, not as an administrative or economic phenomenon, but as a feature of daily life, a presence in the texture of experience that shaped how people related to each other across distance and time. The letter was, throughout the period covered by this history, the primary medium of personal communication between people who were separated by geography. There was no telephone until the very end of the 19th century, no telegraph available to ordinary people until the post office reduced its rates to accessible levels in the 1870s. Before those technologies, the letter was it, the only way to send a personal message to someone who was not in the same room as you, and indeed, the only way to have any kind of extended, considered, private communication with another person at a distance. This meant that the letter carried an enormous weight of human significance. Letters carried news of births, deaths, and marriages. They carried news of illness and recovery, of employment and unemployment, of the thousand small and large events that constituted the progress of a life. They carried declarations of love and expressions of grief. They carried instructions and advice and warnings and congratulations. They carried the ongoing fabric of relationships, the accumulated conversation between people who mattered to each other, conducted at the pace of the Postal Service rather than the pace of speech. For the working people of industrial England, the factory workers and miners and domestic servants who had migrated from their home villages to the industrial cities of the North and Midlands, the letter was often the only connection to the family and community they had left behind. A letter from home, arriving at the mean lodging house or the factory dormitory, was a genuine emotional significance. It was evidence that the people back home were alive and thinking of you. It was news of the world you had left. It was, in the most literal sense, a piece of that world, handled by people who had handled it before sending it, bearing sometimes the smell or the dust of a familiar place. The introduction of the penny post in 1840 transformed this dimension of the postal system as surely as it transformed its economics. Before the penny post, the cost of sending or receiving a letter was a significant burden for working-class people. After it, the cost was trivial. A penny was within the reach of virtually anyone who worked for wages, and the prepayment requirement meant that receiving a letter no longer imposed an unexpected financial demand on the recipient. The floodgates of correspondence that opened in the years after 1840 were not merely a statistical phenomenon. They represented a real expansion of the social fabric of connection. More people in contact with more other people across greater distances than had ever been possible before. The letters that working people wrote to each other in the Victorian period were not, for the most part, literary productions. They were written on cheap paper, often with uncertain spelling and grammar, in handwriting that varied from neat and practiced to laborious and barely legible. They contained the news of daily life, wages, health, the behavior of employers, the price of food, the progress of children, requests for advice and help. They were the written equivalent of conversations that might have taken place over a garden wall or a kitchen table, had the correspondence been in the same place, transposed into the slightly more considered and formal register that writing imposed.
The act of writing a letter was, for many people of this period, a significant undertaking, not in the sense of being difficult or burdensome, but in the sense of requiring a certain deliberateness of purpose. You did not write a letter on impulse the way you might send a text message today. You sat down with paper and ink and thought about what you wanted to say. You chose your words with a little more care than spoken conversation required. You produced something that would be read, perhaps more than once, and that might be kept for years. The letter was a more considered form of communication than speech, and this consideration gave it a particular quality, a quality of attention and intentionality that distinguished it from the casual exchanges of everyday life. The post office building in a Victorian town was not merely an administrative convenience. It was, in a small way, a social institution, a place where people came to conduct postal business, but also sometimes to receive news. In the days before telephone, before wireless, the post office was a point of connection between a town and the wider world. The postmaster was often among the first to know that a particular letter had arrived, that news of significance had come. The post office was where the telegrams, those urgent, expensive, compressed communications, were received and delivered to their sometimes shocked or delighted recipients. The rural postman, the letter carrier who walked or cycled the roads of the countryside, delivering mail to farms and cottages and country houses set back from the lane, was a figure of particular significance in the social geography of rural England. He was often the most regular link between isolated households and the wider world. He brought not only letters, but implicitly the knowledge that the postal system was working, that the connection between this quiet corner of England and the rest of the country was maintained. He knew, by the nature of his work, a great deal about the people on his round, who was expecting letters, who was receiving letters, whose correspondence had changed in character or frequency in ways that suggested changes in their circumstances or their lives. The last 3 decades of the 19th century were years in which the British Post Office confronted for the first time in its history the possibility that it might be superseded, not abolished, but transformed out of recognition by technologies that offered forms of communication faster and in some respects more versatile than the physical carriage of letters. The telegraph had been in existence since the 1840s, operated initially by private companies along the routes of the rapidly expanding railway network. The post office had nationalized the telegraph companies in 1870, bringing the entire inland telegraph network under public ownership. This had been a politically contentious decision, private enterprise versus public provision, a debate that resonated throughout the Victorian period, but it was ultimately justified by the argument that the telegraph, like the post, was a public service that should be universally accessible at regulated rates rather than a commercial service operated for profit. The nationalization of the telegraph brought a new set of responsibilities and a new scale of technical operation into the post office. The telegraph service required skilled operators, men and women trained in Morse code, capable of sending and receiving messages at speed with complete accuracy. It required a physical infrastructure of wires stretching across the country, supported on poles along roads and railway lines, crossing rivers and entering buildings through the walls of post offices and telegraph offices. It required equipment, the instruments for sending and receiving, the batteries for power, the switches and connections for routing messages through the network, and it required the management of a real-time communication system,
in which messages were transmitted and received simultaneously rather than carried physically from place to place. The telephone emerged in the 1870s as an even radical communication technology, one that allowed voice communication in real time over distance. The practical telephone, developed by Alexander Graham Bell and demonstrated in Britain in 1876, was initially a novelty, but quickly became a commercial reality as exchanges were established in the major cities and subscribers were connected by wire to a central switchboard from which they could be connected to any other subscriber. The post office's relationship with the telephone was initially ambiguous. The Postmaster General had a statutory monopoly on telegraphic communication, and a legal question arose as to whether the telephone, which used electrical signals transmitted by wire, fell within the definition of a telegraph, and therefore within the post office's monopoly. In 1880, a legal ruling determined that the telephone was indeed a telegraph for the purposes of the existing legislation, which meant that private telephone companies required licenses from the post office to operate. The period between this ruling and the end of the century saw a complex and not always comfortable relationship between the post office and the telephone companies. The post office licensed private companies to provide telephone services, but also operated its own telephone exchanges in some areas. The competition between public and private telephone provision, the question whether the telephone should be nationalized as the telegraph had been, and the related question whether the telephone would eventually replace the letter as the primary medium of personal communication, all of these were live issues in the 1880s and 90s.
The answer to the last question, whether the telephone would replace the letter, was, in the final decades of the 19th century, far from obvious. The telephone was expensive, available only in urban areas, limited to real-time conversation between people who were both present at their respective instruments simultaneously. The letter, by contrast, could be sent to anyone, anywhere, at any time, and could be read and reread and kept and replied to at leisure. The two media served genuinely different communicative purposes, and the growth of telephone usage in the late Victorian period did not, in fact, reduce the volume of postal correspondence. The bicycle, introduced in its practical modern form in the 1880s, had a modest but real effect on the operations of the rural postal service. A letter carrier on a bicycle could cover his round more quickly than one on foot, extending the range of regular delivery in rural areas. The mechanical systems developed for the sorting and handling of mail also became more elaborate in the later Victorian period. The pneumatic tubes installed beneath London streets in the 1860s, tubes through which cylinders containing letters and telegrams could be propelled by compressed air at high speed from one sorting office to another, were extended and improved. The mechanical stamp affixing machines, the automatic letter weighing scales, the date stamping apparatus, all of the mechanical paraphernalia of the modern post office had its origins in the Victorian period, as the institution sought to manage its growing volume of traffic with the means available to it. Before we leave the Victorian post office entirely, it is worth spending a little time in the sorting room.
not the grand central sorting office of London with its hundreds of workers and its immense floor of pigeonholes, but a smaller office in a provincial town somewhere in the middle of England at 4 o'clock in the morning in February of 1885.
The room is not large. It is illuminated by gas lamps that cast a yellow, slightly unsteady light over the long sorting frames that line the walls. The frames are wooden structures divided into hundreds of small pigeonholes, each one labeled with the name of a street or a village or a district. The labels are handwritten or printed on small cards, and some of them have been amended so many times, streets having been renamed, districts rearranged, new roads built and old ones absorbed, that they bear several generations of annotation in different hands. 3 men work in this room at this hour. They have been here since 3 o'clock in the morning, and will be here until the vans leave for the morning delivery, which is on a good day by 4:30. They work in silence, or nearly in silence. The sounds of the room are the steady snapping of letters being picked up and set down, the occasional rustle of a bag being emptied onto the sorting table, the distant sound of a train on the line that runs past the edge of the town. Each man works his own section of the frame. They have been sorting in this office for years, one of them for nearly 20 years, and the geography of their sorting frames is as deeply familiar to their memory and their muscles, so that the act of sorting a letter, reading the address, moving the hand to the correct location, dropping the letter in, takes perhaps half a second and requires no conscious thought whatsoever. The letters they are sorting this morning represent the correspondence of a town of perhaps 15,000 people. There are letters from London, business correspondence mostly, dealing with orders and accounts and the ordinary commercial traffic of a provincial town with commercial connections to the capital. There are letters from other towns in the region, family correspondence, professional correspondence, the letters of people maintaining relationships across the distances of ordinary life. There are printed circulars, the mass-produced commercial mailings that were already, by the 1880s, a feature of the postal landscape. And there are a few postcards, their brief messages visible to anyone who happened to read them as they passed through the system. Their pictures of seaside resorts and country houses providing a slight visual variety in the otherwise uniform gray-white of envelopes. The sorters are not reading the messages on these letters. They are reading only the addresses, and they are reading them at such speed that their eyes receive only enough information to direct the hand to the correct pigeonhole. A street name, a number, a town, this is all that is needed, and the hand moves before the conscious mind has had time to register the full content of what the eye has seen. It is a form of skilled labor that has almost entirely disappeared from the modern world. The systematic, high-speed, manual processing of information by trained human beings who have made themselves, in a specific and narrow domain, faster and more reliable than any machine available to them. When the sorting is done, when each letter has been allocated to its pigeonhole, and each pigeonhole represents a tidy stack of correspondence for a specific delivery district, the bundles are assembled, wrapped in paper, or tucked into leather satchels, and loaded into the vans that will take them to the letter carriers waiting in the yard. The carriers, in their red coats, will walk their rounds through streets that are just beginning to see the first light of a winter morning,
delivering letters to recipients who will not yet know they have correspondence waiting until the knock at the door or the rattle of the letterbox announces the arrival of the day's post. The letterbox itself, the slot cut in the front door through which letters could be delivered without requiring the recipient to come to the door, was an innovation of the 1850s. Before the widespread adoption of the letterbox, letter carriers had to knock and wait for someone to come to the door for every delivery. The letterbox eliminated this requirement and made the delivery of letters faster and quieter. The carrier could move through his round without stopping at each house for the exchange of pleasantries or the wait for a sleepy household to respond to the knock. It was one of those small, practical innovations that made the whole system a little more efficient, a little more frictionless, in the way that the accumulation of such innovations characterized the development of the post office throughout its history. The years between Rowland Hill's publication of his pamphlet in 1837 and the actual introduction of the penny post in 1840 were, from an administrative and political standpoint, among the most interesting in the history of the post office. They were years of argument, of counter-argument, of competing statistics and contested assumptions, of passionate public advocacy and institutional resistance, years in which the question of how to charge for sending a letter became briefly a matter of national public debate. Rowland Hill had prepared his case with the thoroughness of a man who understood that he was arguing against a powerful institution with a great deal invested in the status quo. His pamphlet was not a vague call for reform, but a detailed technical proposal backed by careful analysis of the post office's own statistics. He had calculated, from the data available to him, the actual cost of carrying a letter, not the charge made to the recipient, but the real cost to the post office of collecting, sorting, transporting, and delivering a single piece of mail. His conclusion was startling. The transportation element of this cost was a negligible fraction of the total cost. The letter itself, once it was in the postal system, cost almost nothing to move from one place to another, because the coaches and the riders were going anyway, and a few thousand letters more or less in the bag made no material difference to the cost of the journey. The real costs, Hill argued, were at the two ends of the journey, the collection and sorting at the origin, and the sorting and delivery at the destination. These costs did not vary significantly with distance. A letter sorted in London and delivered in Edinburgh cost almost exactly the same to process at either end as a letter sorted in London and delivered in Brighton. The elaborate distance-based rate schedule that the post office charged bore almost no relationship to the actual cost structure of the operation. It was a historical artifact, a survival from the era when horses and roads made distance a genuine cost factor that had been preserved by institutional inertia long after it had ceased to reflect economic reality. The post office officials who reviewed Hill's pamphlet and were asked to comment on it were, as we have noted, largely hostile. Their hostility was not merely defensive, it was partly based on genuine technical disagreements with Hill's analysis. They argued that his cost calculations were too simplified, that he had failed to account for various overhead costs, that his estimates of the increase in traffic that would follow a rate reduction were wildly optimistic. The postmaster of the day, the Marquis of Lichfield, appeared before a parliamentary committee and stated flatly that Hill's plan was wild and visionary, a characterization that proved, within a few years, to be spectacularly wrong.
The public reception of Hill's ideas was very different from their official reception. The pamphlet was widely read and widely praised. It was reviewed favorably in the major newspapers. It attracted the attention of reformers and radicals who saw in the postal reform the same logic they saw in other Victorian reforms, that the rationalization of an inefficient and inequitable system would benefit the general public at the expense of vested interests. A national petition in support of the penny post collected an enormous number of signatures, one of the largest petition campaigns of the period. Members of Parliament who had read Hill's arguments or heard them summarized in the press began asking questions in the House. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, who steered the penny post legislation through Parliament, the penny post was, at bottom, a fiscal measure as well as a postal one, since it involved a dramatic change in the revenue expectations of the post office, was Thomas Spring Rice, who became Lord Monteagle. He was sympathetic to the reform and understood both its technical merits and its political momentum. The legislation that authorized the penny post was passed in 1839, and the service began on the 1st of January, 1840, with the adhesive postage stamp following in May of the same year, once the practical arrangements for its production and distribution had been completed. The penny black stamp that was issued in May 1840 was not the only method of prepayment introduced at that time. The post office also issued prepaid envelopes and letter sheets, stationery with the payment incorporated into the envelope or sheet itself, so that no separate stamp was required. These were the design of William Mulrady, a successful Irish artist who had been commissioned to produce an allegorical image appropriate for the occasion. The Mulrady envelope, as it came to be known, featured an elaborate allegory of Britannia dispatching messages across the globe, surrounded by various figures representing the nations and peoples of the empire receiving her communications. The Mulrady envelope was not a success. The design was immediately and extensively satirized. Caricaturists produced parody versions almost before the genuine article had reached the public, and its elaborate allegorical imagery struck many people as pompous and out of keeping with the practical simplicity of the reform it represented. Within a few months, the Mulrady envelopes and letter sheets had been largely abandoned in favor of the plain envelopes and separate adhesive stamps that became the permanent method of prepayment. But the Mulrady envelope is a minor footnote in the history of the postal reform, evidence that even in its moment of triumph, the Victorian post office was not immune to the kind of aesthetic misjudgment that afflicts most large institutions at some point in their history. The post office, in the months after the introduction of the penny post, was an institution in a state of managed crisis. The volume of letters increased so dramatically, so quickly, that the system was genuinely overwhelmed. Sorting offices that had been designed for a certain volume of traffic were receiving 2 or 3 times that volume. Letter carriers who had been walking manageable rounds were carrying bags so heavy with letters that the physical effort of the job increased substantially. The mechanical systems, the scales, the date stamping equipment, the sorting racks were inadequate for the new volume. Staff who had been sufficient for the old system were insufficient for the new one. The post office responded to this challenge by doing what large institutions do when confronted with unexpected scale. It hired more people, it worked its existing staff harder,
It improvised arrangements to manage the overflow, and it planned, with as much speed as the bureaucratic machinery allowed, the construction and fitting out of new facilities designed for the new reality. The expansion of the postal infrastructure in the 1840s was rapid and sustained, driven by the recognition that the penny post had permanently changed the scale of the operation and that no going back was possible. Rowland Hill himself was appointed to a position in the post office in 1840, charged with overseeing the implementation of the new system. His tenure was not always comfortable. The institutional culture of the post office was resistant to his continued involvement in its affairs, and the officials who had opposed his reforms before their introduction did not all become enthusiastic supporters after it. Hill spent years in a somewhat difficult relationship with the permanent staff of the post office, seen by them as an outsider who had forced unwelcome change upon them, respected in the abstract for the success of his reform, but not always treated with the courtesy that his achievement might have warranted.
He was eventually appointed secretary to the post office, its most senior permanent official, a position he held until his retirement in 1864. In the year 1864, he was awarded a knighthood and a public grant of money in recognition of his services to the postal system. When he died in 1879, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor reserved for the most distinguished men and women of the nation. The distance between wild and visionary, as the Postmaster General had called his ideas, and a grave in Westminster Abbey was, in this case, measured in less than 40 years. The buildings in which the Victorian Postal Service operated are themselves a subject worth some attention, because they represent a physical embodiment of the institutional values of the post office in a way that is rarely remarked upon. The purpose-built post offices that began to appear in English towns from the 1840s onward were typically solid, well-proportioned buildings in whatever was the prevailing architectural style of the period. Classical in the earlier decades, Gothic in the middle Victorian period, a kind of dignified eclecticism in the later years of the century. They were built to last, using good materials with generous proportions and careful detailing. They projected in their architecture the qualities that the post office wished to embody in its operation: reliability, permanence, order, and a certain sober dignity that stopped short of grandeur but rose well above mere functionality. The public counter area of a Victorian post office was designed with the customer in mind, or at least with a version of the customer that was somewhat formal and institutional. Counter clerks stood behind wooden or marble counters, separated from the public by a screen with openings through which transactions were conducted. The separation was both practical. It gave the staff their own workspace and kept the public at a manageable distance, and symbolic. It marked the boundary between the public space of the post office and the working space of its employees, between the customer and the institution. Behind the counter, invisible to the public, was the sorting room, where the real work of the post office was done. The sorting room was not designed for aesthetic effect, but for operational efficiency. Long sorting frames along the walls, tables in the center for the initial rough sorting of incoming mail, good lighting to allow the reading of addresses at speed,
adequate heating for the workers who spent long hours in the room in all seasons. The sorting room was, in many respects, the heart of the post office, the place where the incoming stream of letters was processed and directed towards its destinations. In the larger offices, there were additional rooms for telegraphs, for the savings bank, for the storage of stamps and postal orders and other stationery, for the postmaster and his clerical staff. In the very largest offices, in London and the major provincial cities, the scale of the operation required buildings of considerable size, with multiple floors and dozens of rooms, employing hundreds of people and handling millions of letters per year. The sub-post offices that were established in the later Victorian period, smaller, cheaper establishments operated by sub-postmasters under contract with the post office, brought postal services to areas that the full post offices did not reach. A sub-post office might be a room at the front of a shop or a corner of a village store, distinguished from its surroundings by a red postbox on the wall outside and a sign indicating that postal business could be conducted within. The sub-post office was, in a sense, the heir of the earliest provincial post offices, run by a local person of business as a secondary activity alongside their main commercial enterprise, but embedded now in a national network of uniform standards and procedures. The post box, the red cast-iron pillar box that remains one of the most recognizable features of the British streetscape, was introduced in the 1850s, following a successful experiment on the island of Jersey that had demonstrated the advantages of having fixed receptacles in which the public could deposit letters at any time, without requiring the post office itself to be open. The first mainland English post boxes appeared in the early 1850s, initially painted green to blend with the landscape, it was thought, before the post office settled on the red that has been their color ever since. The post box transformed the experience of sending a letter. Before its introduction, letters had to be taken to a post office or receiving house during business hours and handed in personally to a clerk who would stamp them and add them to the outgoing mail. The post box made the process much simpler. The letter could be posted at any hour of the day or night simply by inserting it through the slot in the front of the box, and it would be collected at specified times and taken to the sorting office. The public adopted the post box with enthusiasm, and within a few decades, pillar boxes were a standard feature of every town and most villages in the country. The design of the Victorian post box evolved considerably from its early forms. The first boxes were relatively simple cylinders of cast iron, but later designs became more elaborate, hexagonal or fluted columns with decorative details and the royal cipher of whichever monarch was on the throne at the time of their manufacture. The royal cipher on a post box is, for the patient student of postal history, a useful dating tool. A box bearing the initials VR was made during Victoria's reign, one bearing ED7R during Edward VII's, and so on through the reigns of the 20th century. These letters in cast iron are the geological record of the postal system, embedded in the landscape of British towns and villages. As the 19th century drew to its close, the British Post Office stood as one of the great institutional achievements of the modern world. From the modest relay stations established by Henry VIII in 1516 to the vast, complex, technologically sophisticated organization of 1899, the growth of the postal system traced the growth of England and Britain themselves, from a compact, slow, mostly rural kingdom to the center of a global empire, the most industrialized and urbanized nation in the world, a society of extraordinary complexity and internal connection. The Post Office of 1899 handled somewhere in the region of 2 billion pieces of correspondence per year. It employed more than 200,000 people. It operated post offices in every town and village in the United Kingdom and maintained postal services to most parts of the British Empire beyond. It ran passenger, savings bank, holding the deposits of millions of savers. It provided telegraph services to every part of the country and most of the world. It delivered letters, parcels, postcards, newspapers, and an enormous variety of other material through a network of routes that covered the country with a density that would have seemed miraculous to the postmasters of Elizabeth's reign. The uniformity of the Victorian Postal Service, the same rates everywhere, the same procedures in every post office, the same standard of service whether you lived in London or in a remote village in the Scottish Highlands, was itself an achievement of remarkable significance. It represented the application of a principle of universal service to a public utility, the idea that every person in the country was entitled to the same postal service regardless of where they lived or what they could afford. This principle had been articulated explicitly by the reformers of the 1830s and 40s, and it had been implemented, imperfectly but genuinely, in the decades that followed.
The idea of universal service was not merely an administrative convenience. It was, in a quiet way, a social statement, a declaration that communication was a right of citizenship, rather than a privilege of wealth or geography, that the infrastructure of connection should be available to everyone on equal terms. This was, in the context of Victorian England, a society of deep and, in many respects, accepted inequalities, a more radical notion than it might appear, and the post office's role in embodying and enacting it deserves more recognition than it typically receives. The story of the British Post Office between 1516 and 1900 is, among other things, a story about the relationship between the state and its citizens. The postal system began as an instrument of royal control, a tool by which the crown communicated with its officials and monitored the roads of the realm. It evolved through the pressures of commercial need and popular demand into a public service that served the interests of the general population, and it matured in the Victorian period into an institution that saw itself as having a social obligation to provide universal service, an obligation that required it to operate offices and delivery routes that were not commercially viable in themselves because the principle of universal coverage demanded it. This evolution from instrument of state control to public commercial service to universal social utility is, in compressed form, the story of many of the great institutions of the modern democratic state. The Postal Service traced this trajectory earlier and more completely than most, and the lessons of its development were not lost on the reformers and administrators who built the other great institutions of Victorian public life. There is a particular quality to the experience of holding an old letter, a letter that was written and sealed and addressed and posted and delivered and read and kept, perhaps for many years, before arriving in whatever archive or drawer or collection it now occupies. The paper has a weight and a texture that the screen cannot replicate. The ink is faded to brown or gray, but the handwriting is still legible,
the words still readable, the personality of the writer still present in the particular shape of their letters and the rhythm of their sentences. A letter written in 1740 and sent from a merchant in Bristol to his son in London concerning the shipment of wool and the state of the market has traveled through the postal system described in this history. It was handed to a receiving house in Bristol, and the postboy carried it to the sorting office, where a clerk assessed its weight and its destination and calculated the charge that the recipient in London would pay. It traveled in a mail bag slung across the back of a horse on the Bristol road, changing horses at each stage post through the night, arriving in London before the following morning. It was sorted at the London office and given to a letter carrier who walked it through the streets to the address on the outside, where a servant answered the door and paid the postage and took the letter in to his master.
All of this happened. All of these people, the postboy, the clerk, the horsekeeper, the stage post keeper, the rider, the London sorter, the letter carrier, the servant, played their small part in moving one piece of paper from one person to another. Their names are lost. Their particular roles in this particular transaction are unrecorded. But the system they served, the institution they inhabited, is what this history has tried to describe. The history of the British Post Office between 1516 and 1900 is not, in most respects, a dramatic history. There are no great battles in it, no decisive turning points around which everything else revolves, no single moment of invention or discovery that stands clearly apart from all the rest. It is instead a history of gradual, incremental organizational development, of routes being extended and rates being reformed and procedures being improved and staff being trained and infrastructure being built year by year and decade by decade, until the accumulated weight of all these small changes has produced something that bears almost no resemblance to its starting point, but is nonetheless its direct descendant. The postal service of the late Victorian era was what it was because of everything that had come before it, because of Henry VIII's posting stations and Elizabeth's riders and the controversies of the Stuart period and the innovations of Dockwra and the reforms of Palmer and the genius of Rowland Hill and the patient, anonymous labor of thousands of postmasters and letter carriers and sorters and clerks who kept the system running through the years between these moments of visible change. History remembers the moments of change. The history of the post office is, in the end, a tribute to the years between. The letters have all arrived now. The sorters have gone home. The horses are stabled. The mail coach has pulled into the yard, and the guard has handed over the bags and signed the waybill and gone inside to warm himself by the fire. The letter carrier has finished his round and hung up his bag and taken off his coat and gone home to his tea. The post office is quiet. The history is complete. Sleep well.